Hey everyone, thank you for coming. So today we've invited Marina Gavryushkina, is that right? Yes. And she finished her MSc in digital archaeology last year, and I also saw her speak at the CAA chapter meeting for Germany and the Netherlands in Bochum. I think it was last October.
Yeah.
Ish. Yeah. I was very impressed and very glad that we managed to get her to give a talk here. And today she'll be talking about the spatial analysis of Chlorakas-Palloures, is that how you pronounce it? Using 3D GIS. Sorry, I completely murdered that. No. Okay,
That's
yours.
Yeah, it's kind of a mouthful. But yeah, my name is Marina, and I finished my MSc here last year. So I did the Master's in Digital Archaeology. So it's a good program, difficult to finish in 1 year, but you try really hard to do it. So what I was interested in digital archaeology is mostly documenting and analyzing excavations, so on a site level. And I was thinking about how we could create how we could document a site, and specifically the stratigraphy of a site, in a more intuitive way by using some digital technologies. So, for example, we are now collecting a lot of digital data, like recording units using a total station, creating photogrammetry models of the excavation itself, and how can we use them for analysis. Yeah, and what I thought about is what we do currently, which is 2D plan and section drawings, and I was always a bit frustrated with them. They are a good source of presenting like interpretations of data, reporting sites, but there are some issues with them that I wanted to discuss. So for example, section drawings. We create section drawings of the wall trenches. So in order to capture the full stratigraphy of a trench, you have to do all 4 walls. So you can only show the stratigraphy along a single line across the site. So when you go to publish these, inevitably you publish them as a set of figures. So since what we're looking at is 3D layers of an excavation, section drawings and plan drawings kind of take that 3D data and be projected on a 2D plane. So what I was thinking is 3D GIS could kind of better visualize the data for people and create a better view of the stratigraphy along the entire site. Yeah, for example, any features that lie within the trench itself, and just make it more intuitive and user-friendly. So what exactly do I mean by 3D GIS? What's a 3D GIS model? So for the purposes of my research, 3D GIS models are GIS models, but in the 3rd dimension. And you could argue that GIS is also already kind of 3-dimensional because it includes elevation data. But we call this more 2.5D because you have elevation data, but for example, if you have finds or sites, finds that are located at the same location but at different depths, if you plot it in ArcNav, for example, it'll just be a single point, and you won't get that spatial relationship. So a typical example of 2.5D GIS would be like a topographic map, where you see the elevation, but it doesn't have like overhanging features. It's not fully 3D. So 3D GIS model would be able to display complex spatial relationships fully and in a way that preserves all the spatial relationships between those objects. So this is a good quote that I really like. So 3D GIS is basically a volumetric model specifying all of the layers, features, and objects in full 3 dimensions. Right. Yep. So 3D GIS model is not just the 3D model. It is also located in a coordinate plane. So it also works as a GIS system. So one of the, I think there are 4 basic criteria that 3D GIS has to meet to be like a true GIS system. And these four would be data entry, spatial database, and it should be it should allow for manipulation and analysis of the data, and it should be a tool for reporting and visualization. So basically what this means is a 3D GIS model, in order to be considered true 3D GIS, it should be able to act as a GIS system, and it'd be able to do all the things that a GIS system would be able to do, except for in 3 dimensions. Data entry, of course, is gathering all the data together. Spatial database, it should be able to hold all the data, and it should be able to allow for any kind of analysis. So what I wanted to see is if you could take excavation data and create it and make it into a 3D GIS system. Okay, that's backwards. Yeah, so how is 3D GIS currently being used in archaeological research? So there's been a lot of recent research on this, and there's kind of a lot of articles out there that we went over in our classes last year. So a lot of times it's used for architectural analysis. So for example, one of the projects that uses 3D GIS was the Swedish Pompeii project, where they created a photogrammetric model of insula in Pompeii, and used it for monitoring damage to the architecture, and used it for risk management. This model was also used for a number of experimental research. So for example, whether this model could be used for like a visibility analysis, viewshed analysis. There's also the phenomenological approach, where the model could be used to see what it's like to actually walk through these structures. And very recently, it's also been used for documenting excavations. There's been a number of studies. There's been a few that Lund University has done to see how you can combine different spatial data into a 3D GIS system to show the progress of an excavation. And this included creating photogrammetry models of trenches and bringing in spatial data, so the total station data, the boundaries of units, and combining it into one system and see what can happen. So theoretically, you could have like even photogrammetry models of artifacts, like I have in this photograph here, where you could actually import photogrammetry models into the system, and then if you click on them, it brings up all of the information of that artifact. And this is great because you could actually pan around the photogrammetry models and take a look at the details of the excavation and where all the artifacts are located. What I was interested in is to see if you could better visualize different units, like excavation units within the trenches themselves. So soil layers, architectural features, and create them as volumetric 3D forms. All right, so my research questions, what I wanted to investigate is whether it's possible to combine all of these, okay. I want to see if you could combine different, so when we record excavations with digital methods, you have total station data, you have photogrammetry models. If you could combine all of those various documentation methods into a single 3D GIS system, what I wanted to explore was if there is like a way to model the volumes of units using that data, and what would be a reasonable workflow for creating this model. Basically investigating what works, what doesn't, what needs to be changed, what data we need in order to do this, and how we could simplify the process. All right. Another thing that I want to investigate is if this 3D GIS model could actually be used for analysis. So stratigraphic analysis, spatial analysis, and what is the added value of using this model? Because if we have 2D plan and section drawings, what is the point of creating a 3D GIS model? It might be more complicated, it might be more time consuming, it might need more data. So what is the point of creating one in the first place? Can it actually give us more data or give us a tool to use in order to create more interpretations of the excavation itself? All right, so in order to do this, I chose a case study, a site to investigate, and this was the Chlorakas-Palloures site. This site is located in western Cyprus, and it's Middle to Late Chalcolithic. It was excavated for 3 field seasons by Leiden University, and this was very recent. Yeah, 2015 to 2017. Yeah, this site was quite useful because it used a lot of the digital methodologies that I was talking about. So, for example, there were 3D photogrammetry models created of the bottom of each trench, as well as special features like burials and architectural features. All of the units were recorded with a total station, and Microsoft Access database was used to record all the excavation data. So, like I mentioned, there's photogrammetry models. This is an example of one of the trenches. So this is what the photogrammetry models look like. And total station data. So all of the coordinates of the lots that were taken out were recorded with the total station. So you have the X, Y, Z coordinates and the unit boundaries. Yeah, so as those were recorded with the total station, they could be imported directly into a ArcMap GIS program and mapped out. Along with that, there was the excavation database in Office and some annotated plan and section drawings. Yeah, so what I wanted to see is how you combine them. And one of the first steps was to take a look at all the unit boundaries and the lot locations and convert them into a 3D format. So when you have ArcMap, usually it's a 2D plane. So when you import unit boundaries, all the units show up as stacked on top of each other. They're all this 2D. So what I had to do was bring in the elevation of the vertices of each of these unit boundaries and convert it to a 3D polygon. So there's now tools in ArcMap that will do this, although it does take some time to clean up the units and make sure that everything is, all of the vertices are in a format where you could actually get the elevation right. Now, lot location is pretty easy, also converted to 3D point shape files. And photogrammetry models could be imported into ArcGIS as Collada files. So when I took this data set and converted it to 3D point and polygon shape files, I came up with a model that looked a little bit like, oh, here we go. So these are all the polygons, all the units. So this is what it would look like in ArcMap. And then I made them into 3D. So in Esri ArcGIS ArcC, you could actually import photogrammetry models and import the 3D polygons and point shape files into a single environment. So by combining them and having the photogrammetry models georeferenced, you could see where all the units are within the models. And simply importing the unit boundaries kind of gave you something like this, which is kind of a jumbled mess. So right now, these are all unit boundaries. So with the boundaries themselves, they don't have any color to them, because if you have color to these planes, then you won't be able to see anything underneath unless you toggle the transparency settings. But anyways, it's difficult to get any interpretations from this data. What I wanted to do is see if I could make these volumetric. So get the depth of each unit and actually be able to see which ones lie on top, which ones lie below, which ones intersect, and give a better view of what's going on in these trenches. So I came up with 3 different methodologies in order to do this because it's quite difficult to do this with the tool set that we had in ArcScene. So I came up with 3 methodologies. The first one used like the tool extrude between 2 tins. And this method is quite simple. Basically, the idea of it is all the units lie on top of another unit below it, right? So if you take the top boundary of a unit and extrude it down to the one underneath, you should be able to get an approximation of the volume of that unit. So there's a tool, the extrude between 2 tins tool that will do this, where you take a polygon and extrude it down to the one underneath it. Yeah, so there's a quick view of what that would look like. And in other words, let's say you have a soil layer where you recorded the top of that soil layer and then the top of the one underneath it. You could extrude the top one down to the one on the bottom to get that depth. This works really well. This works really well with pits. So you have the boundary of a pit, and then you extrude it down to either the bedrock or whatever is underneath. So in this case, there's a lot of pits that were recorded close to the bottom of the trench, and you could extrude the boundary down to the tin that created from the photogrammetry model itself. And that worked pretty well. So when I tried this method, came up with a model that looks something like this. This is looking from the bottom up because it's a little bit easier to see what all of the units look like. Because if you look from the top down, you just see the top soil layer. So this is like if you imagine the photogrammetry model is gone, this is looking from down below up top. And so this is kind of what the geometry of each unit looked like. It's a little bit messy. But yeah, this is a little video of what it looks like. I'm sorry it's a bit faded because of the projector, but this is the model that I got after modeling 3 trenches. So yeah, it's hard to see some of the units, but you can actually change the transparency of, let's say, the ones on top to see what's down below. And with ArcScene, you could do something. You can manipulate the data in a way that you can actually look through and see what's underneath. This method took a really long time because if you can imagine, if you look at every single layer, you have to look at the database, you have to look at the data, the drawings, the reference photos, and actually say, okay, well, this unit lies on top of this unit, so I have to extrude this unit down to that one. So I had to do this for every single unit. I had to really take a look and go through all of the steps of modeling it from each unit. And let's say there's a large unit and then something small underneath. The program works in a way where you would only get the volume of the space that overlaps. So if you wanted to model a large soil layer, you have to model it down to every single unit that lies underneath it. Okay. The next method that I found was the minimum bounding volume method. This relies on a tool where, let's see, if you have points, you could automatically create a form around those points, and it uses those points as the vertices of the polygon that it creates. So in order to create the volume of each unit, what I used was the vertices of the unit boundary that was recorded and the artifacts found within that unit that were associated with that unit. So theoretically, you'd have the vertices on top, and then whatever is found within would give you the volume of that unit. However, the tool is a little bit gimmicky, where it actually simplifies the shape around the points. And what it gives you is kind of like an exaggerated like an exaggerated form that makes sure that it encompasses everything without taking into account concavities in the unit. So this is what I came up with. It looks a lot smoother than the other method. However, for example, if you had a unit without any artifacts associated with it, it wouldn't be modeled, because the boundaries, the unit boundaries, the vertices of boundary would lie on a single plane, well, oftentimes, and so there's no 3D shape being formed. So this method, yeah, I'll show you the video of what this one looks like. It ended up with a lot of holes in the trench, which we know is not true. So with this method, it was a good idea, but I found that it was kind of unreliable when it came to accurately modeling the volume of each of the units. So it was a good idea, but if you're going to use this method, I think the tool has to be improved in order to show concavities in each of the units, or you have to make sure to record multiple points for every single unit instead of just using the boundaries. Okay, so the third method relies on the photogrammetry models itself. So this method is actually inspired by the method that Leiden University uses in order to model some of their excavations. What you could do is you could import the photogrammetry model into Arcscene, and you could draw right on top of it. So what I did was I looked at the reference reference annotations that were created during the excavation, so the section drawings that were created. Those section drawings were created by also taking the photogrammetry model and creating orthophotos of that model. So for example, you have an image of just like the northern wall of the trench, and then the flattened out, and then the excavators drew on top of it to show the different soil layers. So I looked at those annotated section drawings, and then I recreated them on top of the photogrammetry models. Next, it's difficult to see here, but basically I took the different boundaries of those soil layers based on my drawing and connected them into the intersections of each of the units. So the stratigraphy based on the annotated drawings. Next, you can create tins out of those. So I created tins out of those planes, and then I used the same extrude between tins tool to create the volume of each of the soil layers. And this is what the model looked like. So it's a lot more watertight or airtight than the method before it. Basically, there's no gaps within the stratigraphy. However, I'll show you the video. Now, as you can see, there's no gaps. You can see the different soil layers, but the only units that I managed to model were the ones that showed up in the wall, in this wall stratigraphy. So anything within the trench, like pits or any like architectural units that weren't connected to the walls of the trench, weren't modeled. So what I would consider this as is like a three-dimensional version of section drawings. Just connect them. And just like regular 2D section drawings, it does mean that like any of the interior features are lost. Yeah, so to compare these methods, some of them worked better than others for certain feature types. So for example, for wall features, the minimum bounding volume method didn't work so well because there were some glitches with the tool itself. So it took the outermost points and connected them into a kind of exaggerated form of the volume of that unit. For pits, all of the methods worked pretty well, although if you extruded tins and you had like a piece of the wall, a piece of the photogrammetry model that you're extruding down to that's slightly vertical, it gives you like strange kind of projections. It's difficult to get that one right. Soil layers, as you can see with minimum bounding volume, again, it's a little bit exaggerated. It doesn't follow the contours of the model. The extrude between tins tool, as I said before, you have to use the method several times if you want to get the full extent of the unit if there are smaller units underneath. Digitizing section stratigraphy, that method was a little bit better for soil layers because you can clearly see the soil layers within the trench walls. Yeah, so as I said before, there are issues with every single method, and certain methods work better for certain feature types. Yeah, so the nice thing about ArcMap and GIS systems in general is you can connect the excavation database to each of the units that you model. So just like any 2D GIS system, you could color code units based on attributes in the attribute table. So that's what I did here. Basically, I divided up the units based on the feature types. So soil layers in green, architectural features or walls in purple, and you could toggle the transparency of each of the layers to see what's going on down below. This was the extrude between tins method, which I found was the most reliable to actually look at the volume of each of the units. Yeah, so once you connect the excavation database, you could also query information about each unit. So you could pan around the model, you could make different layers transparent to see what's underneath. You could click on each of the units and it will pull up all of the information from the excavation database. Yeah, you could even compare the spatial relationship of units in between different trenches, even if those trenches were excavated at in different years or different times. Yeah, so there's different ways of viewing the data based on the different attributes, just like in a GIS system. Right. So what I want to see is if this methodology of creating a 3D GIS model of an excavation would actually help you with solving stratigraphic problems, if you could use it for analysis. So one of the questions that came up during the excavation was the relationship between two structures in trenches that are adjacent to each other. So this structure here and this structure down here. So were they contemporaneous? What is the relationship between them? Yeah, and so putting everything together into this model of the excavation, you could kind of compare the spatial relationship between them. Here is the model with some of the soil layers turned off or made invisible so you could see what's underneath. What I liked about the model is you could pan around it. So you could actually just move around and view it from different angles, just kind of basically view the excavation even off-site. And so what I found is there was, let's see, hold on, okay. Yeah, there were several features that stood out to me while looking at this model and looking at the units that were found within it. So first of all, the structure in this trench here really did look like it was much higher up than the one in the trench next to it. You could clearly see the height difference from the model itself. Interestingly enough, during the excavation, the structure didn't really continue on into the trench next to it. So there weren't any wall features found where you would expect them to be. and it was assumed that this was caused by erosion, plowing, some kind of post-depositional processes. Yeah, because there weren't any like wall units recorded down here. There was a section of a wall here coming out of the structure below, and nothing connecting to it either. Yeah, so there was another few units found close to this structure that didn't seem to relate to it, except for they were in close proximity. There were also no wall structures found over here. But putting into a 3D GIS model and combining the units themselves with the photogrammetry model gave you a better sense of spatial context when it comes to looking at these units. So you can see in the photogrammetry model there, it looks like there are some stones projecting through the trench wall that might be related to the structure. And same down here. So there are some stones in the trench wall here that if you could imagine might actually have been part of a third structure over here that might have been destroyed. Let's see. Yeah, so what I thought was perhaps there was some kind of erosion event, or maybe some kind of plowing that might have taken out a lot of the wall on in this structure, as well as the structure up above, and that's why we can't see the wall extending into the trench next to it. So so I thought maybe there might be another structure here that's just been destroyed, and so we don't see a lot of evidence of it. But if that is the case, then it clearly looks like these two structures up here might not have existed at the same time. Because if there was another architectural feature connected to this one here, it would have laid below this building up here, and this building would have overlapped with what was below it. So what I thought was perhaps this might be evidence that there were multiple uses of this space and multiple occupation periods, perhaps. But this is just by looking at the model. So it might be a good idea to go back and actually excavate the trench wall to see if there's any more relationship between these two features that can be found. Yeah. So it seems to be an interesting tool to take a look at these kinds of spatial relationships, to go back and review the questions that were formed in the field and the interpretations that were formed in the field, and see what we could look at further. Yeah, what I liked about it is, I said, you could pan around, you could explore different areas of the model, different stratigraphic problems that you might have had, and kind of look at it in a different way. So the combination of the volumes of each unit and the photogrammetry model gives you a good understanding of the context of each of the units. What I really liked is just being able to click on each of the units and pulling up all of the data about it. And comparing different trenches. So unlike section drawings and plan drawings, you could clearly see the relationship between units found within a trench and the trench adjacent to it. And during the excavation process, this might not always be possible because different trenches are excavated in different years and then covered up. So you could see them both in relation to each other and in relation to the rest of the site. Yeah, however, there were a lot of problems. This I got a lot, a lot. Yeah, ArcScene is an interesting tool. It seems to be, it offers you a lot of possibilities of what you could do. However, there are definitely bugs to it, and there's some things where it worked yesterday and now it doesn't work anymore. Yeah, so technological limitations, a lot of the file sizes that I used were pretty big. Loading the model took a lot of time. Sometimes high processing power is required. For example, it worked a lot faster on my laptop than it did on school computers. Um, yeah, like you had to have the newest version of ArcScene in order to use some of the tools. So there are definitely technological problems that arose. Accessibility as well. I no longer have a license for ArcMap, so I couldn't create new figures for this presentation or access my models. Yeah, so there's definitely some accessibility issues, especially since ArcMap are expensive programs to have, and I have not found that QGIS has the same functionality. But as well, methodological limitations. So as I mentioned before, the three different methods of modeling the volumes of each of the units resulted in like vastly different results and vastly different volumes sometimes. And so what I would like to think about is maybe better methods of recording the volume of stratigraphic units as opposed to just getting the boundaries of them. Okay, so what I see it as is a tool. So you could create a 3D GIS model, and it could be a tool to really look at the spatial data that you have. But of course, interpretations made in the field are very important. And as throughout this process, I noticed that section drawings, plan drawings are also really helpful. So you have to have multiple lines of evidence to support your interpretations. Yeah, and yeah, there's a lot you could do with this. Like I think a lot of my research really made me think about what's possible today, but also what we could do in the future, how we could experiment with different excavation documentation methods in order to facilitate like a project like this. So the data that I used was digital data, however, it wasn't specifically designed to create a 3D GIS model. And this research was good for showing me like what kind of data that we need in order to make this model more accurate. So perhaps like in future years, like maybe it would be good to experiment with different methods of documenting in order to change the way we, well, not necessarily excavate, change the way that we record data in order to make this a reality. So also maybe creating the models on site as opposed to in the lab, like a year after the excavations are completed would be helpful. The Lund University experiments that they did, they basically created photogrammetry models and all of their data in the field daily and put them together in the field, and so there you could actually look at the model as you're going and see if there's anything missing in the excavation documentation, and you could guide your excavation from there by taking a look at the spatial data while you go. So it would be good for reflexive archaeology to actually be able to do this kind of thing in the field. Yeah, another thing that I would find really cool would be actually using the capabilities of GIS. So color coding the different units based on attributes in more interesting ways, such as like densities of artifacts, like where lithics were found, where they weren't. And if you have radiocarbon dates for a lot of the units, then you can maybe combine this into some kind of time-lapse model. Just like in GIS, you could have different features appear based on the dating of those features. You could probably do this with a 3D GIS model as well, so you could see how the site was formed. Another thing would be really cool is just to incorporate virtual reality technology, which is cool in in any project really, but having a 3D GIS model that you could walk through, or for example, just like being able to pan through the layers easily would be really cool, but also really really useful for just looking at the stratigraphy of the site. I put up this image because there were some studies done where you could create the volumes of units based on the photogrammetry models of the top and the bottom layers of the units. But this is kind of similar to what would be cool to do, but this takes a lot of really high processing power. Yeah. So in the future, it'll be good to explore this methodology further. In conclusion, I really don't know if we're quite there yet, but hopefully this kind of research will help us get closer to something like this, where you could actually see the volumes and recreate an excavation in a more intuitive, user-friendly model. Yeah. So I think that's about it.
Okay, are there any questions? Comments? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I have more questions than one, but I'll start with one. Thank you for your presentation. It was very nice and very inspiring for people. My first question would be, you only used ArcScene as a software, or did you use some other type of 3D modeling software?
No.
Some of the methods?
I only used ArcScene. Yeah. Photoscan for creating photogrammetry models and turning them into a format that you could import into ArcScene. But all of the 3D modeling methods specifically, I did in ArcScene. I did attempt to do it in what was the
Blender.
Yes, I attempted to do it in Blender. I couldn't do it. Maybe I wasn't familiar enough with Blender, but it was easy enough to import the data into Blender itself, but it had to be georeferenced. So keeping it georeferenced and actually creating the volumes within that program is really difficult. So I wasn't able to do it. Yeah, but if you have any suggestions for other programs you could use.
No, I'm not a programmer.
You should try Gross in the end, as well. Gross GIS, because I think they also have some 3D package.
Yeah.
Well, at least it's possible to go from 2D into 3D just visualization. I'm not sure if they also have the tools really English. Might be.
Yeah, I haven't explored GIS enough. But it'll be interesting to take a look at.
Because it's also free.
Then I can afford it. All right. Yes.
Thank you again for a very interesting lecture. I was wondering, because in your third method, you use the section drawings based on the photogrammetric orthophotos. But for the first method, you only use the total section points, right?
Yes.
Did you have plan drawings on the basis of the photogrammetric orthophotos as well that you could sort of implement into that first method to make it more reliable?
Yeah, I did. So for let's go back to it. The extrude between tins method, the first one, part of the reason why it took so long to model everything was because I looked at every single unit individually. So for example, doing the soil layer here, I wouldn't just look at what's underneath in the 3D GIS environment. I also took a look at if I had access to them, if they were in the section drawings themselves. So I used that as like a second line of evidence to see which ones lay on top of each other, and plan drawings as well, and the information recorded in the excavation database. So for every single unit, I would cross-reference between all of the different yeah, all of the different data that was collected during excavation and say, okay, based on what was recorded, this unit lies on top of this unit, or this unit is intersected by this unit. So in my model, when I do the extrude between tins, I need to use this other unit as the bottom point.
But the contours here are just the total station points, right?
Yes, the contours are just total station points, except for if you had a unit that, something like a pit where you had the photogrammetry model right below it with nothing else underneath. I'd use the photogrammetry model.
And my second question was, with this extrude between tins method, it sort of presupposes that all your units are sort of equal to each other and not butting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did you find a way to work with units that cut each other, or they are overlapping, or
No.
more complex or different?
Yeah, because like with this method, all you have is the top and bottom, right? So if you had any units that did intersect each other, the volumes of those units intersected each other as well. So in the model itself, you just see like this fuzzy bit of them intersecting. And with ArcScene, sometimes if you like zoom in or view something in a certain angle, like whole unit either disappears or you can't quite see the relationship between them, especially when they overlap. Yeah, so that was kind of it was a pretty big issue. Another thing that I found was uncertainty is difficult to model. How do you model uncertainty? If you're not quite sure whether layers are intersecting or not, it's difficult, because when you create a model like this, you're just like, okay, well, these are the spatial relationships between these units, and anybody who looks at the model will be like, okay, that must be true, because you see them as physical forms. Yeah, so it kind of doesn't give you a lot of room for showing different interpretations of those relationships. Mm-hmm.
Any more questions? Victor?
Of course, all the questions. It's an amazing thing that you managed to get together, especially with the complex data. And I think it really well illustrates how important it is that the field data has a particular quality, and that all these things. This is like the first step in creating a better field documentation system, which then can be checked again for your PhD or something. Yeah, we're working on this now, and this is really very important for that.
Mm-hmm.
So just wanted to mention that.
So what would be the ideal data for you that they should record in the field? What do you think you need?
Yeah, that's the question, right? Because the data that I worked with, I had to piece together like, okay, this is what I have. What can I do with it? But if I was designing a documentation method with the purpose of a 3D GIS model like this, I would definitely think about like a single context excavation method where you record the top of the unit itself, but also where it ends. So not just the first time you see it, but also the extent of it. So what you really need to create the volume of each one is data about the volume. And that's not something that we usually record. And it's also difficult to do that as well, because once you remove a unit, then okay, where was it? Where does one start and one end? Yeah. So I would experiment with that and try to get the depth of each of the units. Not entirely sure exactly how to do it, but it would be helpful. But also, like I mentioned before, putting all of the data into either a 3D GIS environment or just the GIS system every single day, daily, to be able to check, okay, like make sure all of the units that were excavated were recorded and were recorded properly. Because sometimes gets there's sometimes errors made, and some don't get recorded, and then you're just like, okay, I guess I'm gonna have to I'm gonna leave that one out. Yeah, so I think that would be my advice. Yeah.
Final question?
Yeah, to add to what you're saying, because also this is somehow my concern, how to record and to feed the different units, so that you have like a 3D representation of the boundaries. Do you think I've seen it used for some people that if you expose a unit, if you are able to distinguish a unit and expose it, would you think that a cloud of points with the total station would be helpful for 3D modeling? So it's like taking the total station and shooting random points everywhere so that you somehow make a surface?
Yeah.
Do you think that this would be helpful?
I think for that second method, it would.
Yeah, the second
Help.
method it would help for sure. Let me get back to the end of this one. So this is kind of what they did here, except for instead of just like a few random points for the total station, this is a point cloud. So when you create a photogrammetry model of the top of the unit and then the bottom of it, you have the point clouds, and then you could connect those into like an enclosed point cloud as the volume. This is probably, this is a lot of detail, and this would take a lot of processing power. I think if you use that method where you record points with the total station, it would help. You wouldn't get as much detail as something like this, but it would definitely be adding to the accuracy of this modeling method. Using it for the second method for the, what was it called? Yeah, the bounding volume method where you take the points and create a shape. It would help, but I'm worried that the tool itself in ArcScene is just not accurate enough to be able to capture the geometry between those points accurately. Like I mentioned before, it gave you a very simplified shape where it just took like the very outermost points and kind of created a form around it. So the theory behind it is pretty solid. Okay, yeah, you could just create like a shape around all the points, but I think that tool has to be improved in order to make it useful.
So really a proper 3D modeling functionality of the GIS within the GIS would be the ideal solution for this, wouldn't it?
Yeah, developing more tools or better tools. Yeah, I think so. Because ArcScene wasn't designed for this. No, but yeah, like more open source GIS programs might be interesting to explore. Then you can create your own tools and see what works.
Blender apparently is working on GIS capabilities, so there might come a link there.
Yeah, I hope so. I really tried Blender.
That's
I didn't learn.
it takes a while to
Yeah, there's a learning curve. Mm-hmm.
Actually, talking about field workflows, there's a project I worked at Marina in Sicily, and they every day for every unit they excavate, they do photogrammetry.
Yeah.
So literally like this.
Like this.
So every day at the end of the day, they process all the pictures. It all goes onto tablets. The next day, you have the data in the field. You have all your units related to it. They have a huge field team, but also a huge lab team to do all this. And they take total station points, so it's georeferenced straight away. So they take the normal drone trench photographs, but also just really unit-based photogrammetry.
Yeah,
So that's
like I think.
But it takes so much time and manpower. That's the issue.
Yeah.
You have one guy only dedicated to that, and then all the archaeologists in the field have to be. They're responsible for taking all the pictures and taking all the total station points.
It's an interesting question. Yeah, because like most excavation, like Palloures was kind of like a rescue operation. You weren't sure if you we're gonna keep the land and be able to do more investigation, so you have to go fast.
Mhm.
So where do you find that balance between reporting and
Yeah,
if you
they
have
actually
like
had Wi-Fi on site. So what they were doing in the lab was pretty much real-time updated to the site, which was a few kilometers away. But that's insane. You can barely implement that on a normal excavation.
well, the other question is how much processing power does it take?
Mhm.
Because like from what I read, even a model like this, it has so many points that it takes like a huge amount of storage space and processing power to even to create something like this, which is just like 4 layers of a pit. How are you supposed to combine all of those photogrammetry models into a single model of an entire site? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, every day it just ran overnight for them.
Yeah, and then when you try to load it or try to present it or share it, how do you do that? Yeah. So like, interestingly enough, I think another question that arose through my research was this balance between accurately modeling units and how detailed you have to be. You know, how detailed should the photogrammetry model be in order to accurately model the geometry? But for example, the photogrammetry models that I used, I had to decimate the mesh like incredibly. Like it ended up being like trying to remember. Like not a lot of points. It's a really low quality photogrammetry model because if you use the high quality one, ArcSeed would crash. Like you couldn't draw on it anymore. There's a certain like quality. Well, there's certain file size that you had to use in order to be able to actually draw on top of the photogrammetry model in ArcSeed. And if you wanted to combine the total station data and the models, like forget about it. Yeah. So like, what are you using it for? Photogrammetry models are really nice and really high quality for presenting to the public for visualization purposes. If your whole point is to like really examine the details and the skeleton that you found within it. But for something like this, it doesn't have to be up to that level. This is like there's this balance between usability and image quality, I suppose.
Okay, let's leave it at that. We can continue this over drinks. And let's like speaker again.
Yeah,